The lighthouse keeper. The lighthouse stood on the westernmost point of the headland, a white tower of rendered stone built in 1863 and painted every few years since, the paint always the same white, always the same sequence of preparation and undercoat and topcoat, the work done in the summer when the weather permitted and the scaffolding could be erected without the wind taking it. From the sea the lighthouse appeared small against the headland being very large, a mass of dark dolerite that dropped on its western face directly into the Southern Ocean in cliffs of between 40 and 100 meters, depending on where along the face you measured. From the land the lighthouse appeared to be at the edge of the world, which in certain weathers it effectively was, the visibility zero and the sound of the sea so large and close that the land itself seemed to be moving. Owen Callahan had been keeping the light at Cape Farewell for 3 years. He had come to it after a working life that had included a decade of fishing out of Strahan and 5 years of marine research work with the university at Hobart, work that had kept him on the Southern Ocean for much of the year, and he had applied for the lighthouse keeper position when it was advertised without any very clear reason beyond the feeling that it was what he wanted to do next, a feeling he had learned over the years of the fishing and the research to trust more than he had initially. The interview had been brief, and the appointment had come within a week, and he had been at Cape Farewell, which was 5 hours by road from Hobart, and then an hour in a small boat from the nearest landing, within a month of the appointment. He was the only keeper, the light having been automated in the 1980s, but the role of the resident keeper retained by the authority for reasons of safety monitoring and equipment maintenance. In other countries and on other coasts, the lights had been unmanned entirely, the automation trusted to run without supervision, but on this coast and particularly at this lighthouse, the authority had maintained the view that a resident keeper was necessary, partly because the equipment was older than was ideal and prone to failures that required immediate human attention, and partly because the headland itself was in a position and a weather regime that made the consequences of a light failure potentially serious, the shipping lanes not heavily used but not empty, and the coast of Tasmania being the coast it was. He was 41 years old when he took the position. He had grown up in Strahan, on the west coast of Tasmania, the son of a fisherman and a schoolteacher, and the sea had been part of his life from the beginning, the fishing boats in the harbour and the smell of the Southern Ocean always present. He had been on the water from the age of 12, crewing for his father on the weekends and in the school holidays, learning the handling of the boats and the reading of the weather and the particular character of the water around the west coast of Tasmania, which was a character unlike any other water he had later encountered. The west coast of Tasmania was a coast of dark tannin-stained rivers and dense rainforests that came to the water's edge, and beyond that the open Southern Ocean, the ocean that reached without significant interruption to the Antarctic ice, and the weather that came off that ocean was the weather he had grown up understanding. The decade of commercial fishing after his father retired had given him a more thorough understanding of the southwest coast than most people who worked on it, the fishing taking him to grounds that the tourist boats did not reach, and into weather conditions that tested his knowledge of the sea and its behavior around these coasts. He had fished for abalone and for southern bluefin, and for the various species of the deep water off the continental shelf, and he had learned the grounds and the weather patterns and the behavior of the sea in different conditions with the practiced attention of someone whose livelihood and safety depended on that knowledge. The Southern Ocean off the southwest tip of Tasmania was a sea that demanded respect, not because it was unpredictable. It was in fact quite predictable in its patterns, but because its moods when they came were extreme and the consequences of being caught in the wrong place in the wrong conditions were severe. The years of the marine research with the university had been different, the research giving him a more systematic understanding of the ecology of the southern waters, the surveys of the seafloor and the biological transects and the tagging programs for the various species of interest giving him a scientific framework for what he had known experientially from the fishing. He had found the two kinds of knowledge sitting comfortably together, the experiential and the systematic being complementary rather than contradictory, the systematic giving structure to the experiential and the experiential giving texture to the systematic, and the combination making him a more useful research collaborator than a purely academic person would have been. He had been valued in the research years for this combination, and he had valued the work, but he had found at the end of 5 years that the researcher's relationship to the sea was still the relationship of a person studying it from outside, and he had wanted something different, had wanted the relationship of a person simply present in it and attending to it, which was what the lighthouse had offered. His accommodation was in the keeper's cottage attached to the Lighthouse Tower, a stone building of 2 rooms and a small kitchen and a bathroom that had been added later, in the 1950s, and which was slightly warmer than the main rooms because its walls were thinner and the heat from the kitchen stove reached it more directly. The cottage was 50 meters from the cliff edge on the calmer southern side of the headland, and on the clearest days you could stand at the kitchen window and see the sea to the south, and to the west and to the north, and in 3 directions there was nothing between you and Antarctica, which was not far as oceanic distances go, far enough that it was abstract but close enough that the weather that came from it was very specific and identifiable. The westerly gales came in the autumn and the winter, and sometimes in the spring, and they came from the Southern Ocean with nothing to break them for thousands of kilometers before they reached the headland, and they arrived at full strength, fully formed, the wind and the sea having had the whole width of the Southern Ocean to develop in. Owen had been told by the previous keeper, who had stayed for 1 week to show him the light and the equipment and the routines, that the westerlies were different from other wind in this place, that they arrived with a quality of intention that other winds did not have, that the westerly did not build up slowly from a starting point of calm, but arrived already at full strength, as though it had been waiting for this particular headland for the duration of its crossing. He had thought this was dramatic language at the time. He understood it now. He had stood in the westerly wind many times in his 3 years at Cape Farewell, and each time he stood in it he felt again the quality of it that the previous keeper had described, the quality of intention, as though the wind were not merely a meteorological phenomenon but something directed, something with a destination in mind, and the destination was this particular headland and the wind was impatient to arrive. The headland itself, apart from the lighthouse and the cottage and the equipment buildings, was bare. Bare was the right word. No trees, no shrubs that were taller than his knee, just the mat of grass and the low prostrate plants that had adapted to the wind over whatever period such plants adapted over, their growth directed sideways rather than upward, because the wind did not permit upward growth on this exposed a point. In the sheltered southern bay where the supply boat landed there were a few stunted trees, bent permanently to the east as though leaning away from something, which of course they were. He had photographed these trees in his first month, as a record of what 3 decades of westerly wind did to a living thing, the record being quite extreme, the trunks of the trees at 45 degrees from vertical, the branches extending only to the east, the whole tree shaped by a force so consistent and so strong that it had become the tree's predominant condition rather than an occasional influence. The first gale of the 3-week period arrived on a Monday in the middle of June, in the 3rd year of his keeping. He had been watching the barometer for 2 days, the pressure dropping steadily from the comfortable high that had given them a clear week in late May, dropping through the upper teens and into the teens and then below 1500, and still dropping, and the sky to the west had been building with the particular character of a Southern Ocean depression, the cloud coming in layers, the highest cloud first and then the middle cloud and then the low cloud, and on Sunday evening the low cloud was over the headland and moving fast, and the swell that had been building for days was now very large, the sets arriving from the west at intervals that he could time from the kitchen window, the long rollers building as they approached the shallower water of the headland, and breaking on the rocks below the cliff in explosions that he could feel as much as hear, the vibration of them travelling up through the rock of the headland and into the floor of the cottage, a low periodic shuddering that he had learned in his first winter to sleep through. He did his 7 o'clock check on Sunday evening in the last of the usable light, the wind already gusting to 45 knots on the anemometer, the barometer at 1004, and still falling. He checked the light, which was running normally, the rotating mechanism smooth and the lamp bright, and he checked the fog signal equipment, which he would need before morning if the cloud came lower, and he checked the mooring of the equipment shed door, which was prone to banging in high winds if the latch was not secured with the additional hook he had installed in his first winter. And he went back inside and made his log entry and ate his dinner and read for a while in the armchair by the window. The window showing him the last of the light, the western sky very dark and very low, and then he went to bed. He woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of the wind at full strength. The cottage shook. This was not a metaphor but a literal description. The building shook, not violently, not in a way that suggested structural failure, but with the trembling of a solid thing subjected to enormous external force, the walls and the roof responding to the pressure of the wind, and the windows in their frames rattling in a constant rhythm that was not regular, was the random pattern of gusts and lulls within the larger pattern of the gale. He knew the difference between the shaking that was part of the normal response of the building to the gale, and the shaking that would indicate something wrong. And this shaking was the former, the familiar shaking that he had experienced in this building many times before, and he lay in the dark for a moment and assessed it, and concluded that the building was fine, and then he got up. He lay in the dark for a moment first. This was a habit he had formed in the first gale winter, the moment of lying still in the dark and listening before getting up, using the first conscious attention of the nighttime to assess the weather, without the interference of moving and dressing, just the listening. He had been a person who got up quickly in his earlier life, who went from sleep to standing in the single motion that the alarm demanded, and the lighthouse had changed this, had introduced the moment of lying and listening as a professional necessity in the first gale winter, and it had remained as a habit long after the necessity had become automatic, the listening having become part of his relationship to the place and the weather rather than a specific assessment procedure. The lighthouse itself was worth understanding as an object. He had spent his first weeks at Cape Farewell reading the documentation that the authority provided, the history of the light and the specification of its equipment, and the log of the previous keepers, and the lighthouse had emerged from this reading as a more interesting object than he had understood it to be before. The tower had been built in 1863, at a time when the south coast of Tasmania was becoming more frequented by the shipping that moved between the eastern colonies and the ports of the Southern Ocean route to Europe, and the light at Cape Farewell had been established to mark the southwestern extremity of the Tasmanian landmass for vessels making this passage. The building had been designed by the colonial engineer of the period, a competent man working in the tradition of lighthouse design that had been established in Britain in the first half of the 19th century, and the tower was built to specifications that had proven durable, the stone walls being thick enough to withstand the westerly gales and the foundation being bedded directly in the dolerite of the headland, which was the ideal foundation material. The Fresnel lens that now rotated in the lamp room was the third lens the lighthouse had used, the original lens having been replaced in the 1890s and the second lens replaced in the 1950s when the light was upgraded to a more powerful source. The current lens was a fourth-order Fresnel, the prisms of optical glass arranged in the concentric rings of the Fresnel design that concentrated the lamp's output into the rotating beam, and it had been in the lamp room for 60 years and still performed with the efficiency of a well-maintained precision optical instrument, the glass prisms clear, and the alignment accurate, and the rotating mechanism turning smoothly on its bearings. He had a respect for the lens that went beyond the professional maintenance relationship, the lens being an object of considerable craftsmanship and considerable age, a piece of Victorian optical engineering that still did its job after 60 years, and that he cleaned with particular care at each monthly cleaning, the circular motion of the cloth on the glass being a kind of gratitude as much as a technique. He could tell a great deal from the sound in this first moment, the wind speed from the pitch and volume of the various sounds the building made, the sea state from the depth and frequency of the vibration through the floor, the rain from the specific sound of it against the windows as opposed to the spray which was lighter, and any change in the pattern of the night's weather from the comparison of what he heard now with what he had heard before sleeping. This night the wind was at full strength and the rain was heavy and the sea vibration was as it had been, the gale unchanged through the hours of his sleep, and he lay for this moment and understood this and then got up and dressed. He lay in the dark and listened. The sound of the wind at this strength was not a simple sound but a complex one, many sounds at once, the deep bass note of the wind itself over the headland, and the higher frequencies of the wind through the lighthouse structure, and through the guy wires of the anemometer, and through the gaps in the window frames, and the various gaps in the cottage itself, that years of weather had opened in the pointing between the stones. Beneath all of this the sea, the sound of it so large that in this wind it was not the sound of individual waves, but the sound of a continuous roar, the sea in this weather continuous rather than intermittent, the waves arriving faster than the previous wave had finished breaking, the water white along the full length of the cliff face. He got up and dressed and went to the lighthouse. This was the routine in bad weather, the check at 2 a.m. regardless, the confirmation that the light was running and the equipment was functioning. He put on his heavy weather gear, the oilskin jacket, and the waterproof trousers and the boots and the hat with the strap under the chin, and he went out the cottage door into the gale. The force of the wind in the open was startling in the way it was always startling, despite knowing it was there, despite having felt it many times before. The wind at this strength was a physical presence, a wall of moving air with genuine weight behind it, and stepping into it from the shelter of the cottage doorway was to encounter that weight immediately and completely, the whole body registering it at once, the jacket pressing back against the chest and the hat pulling at its strap, and the legs having to lean into the wind to maintain balance. He walked the 50 meters from the cottage to the lighthouse door with his head down and his body angled into the wind, and it took longer than 50 meters would normally take, the wind pressing against every step, and when he reached the lighthouse door and pulled it open against the wind and stepped inside, the relief was immediate, the suddenly sheltered air in the stairwell almost still by comparison. He climbed the stairs. The lighthouse had 72 stairs, a number he knew precisely from the first week, when he had been given the specification sheet for the lighthouse and had noted it and confirmed it by counting. 72 stairs of iron, circular, spiraling upward in the narrow cylinder of the tower. He climbed them in the dark, not bothering with the torch because he knew the stairs well enough now to climb in the dark, his hand on the central column and his feet finding each step from memory, the pitch of the staircase and the rhythm of the climbing as familiar as any movement he made in a day. He climbed steadily, not slowly because the stairs were familiar, but not quickly because there was no need for speed, and because the gale outside was audible even inside the tower, though muted, the thick stone walls attenuating but not eliminating the sound of the wind. At the top he pushed open the door to the lamp room and checked the light. The light was running normally. The rotating mechanism, driven by a motor that he serviced every 3 months according to the schedule, turned the lens at its specified rate, and the lamp was bright, and through the glass of the lantern room he could see the beam sweeping, the arc of it visible for perhaps 200 meters in the driven rain before it was absorbed by the weather, which was much less than the designed range of the light, the range for which the light was rated being for clear conditions, and these were not clear conditions. He checked the fog signal. The fog signal was not yet activated because the visibility, though poor, was not yet below the threshold at which the signal was required to sound, but he checked the mechanism and found it ready. He noted the time and the conditions in the log he carried in his jacket pocket, the small waterproof notebook in which he made the 2-hourly entries during bad weather, and he descended the stairs and went back out into the gale. The walk back to the cottage. 50 meters. The rain was horizontal now, driven by the wind so that it came not from above but from the west, and it struck the left side of his face and his left shoulder and left arm with the sound and the force of something thrown rather than something falling. He had his eyes half closed against it, and he walked with his head turned slightly to the right side of his face taking less weather than the left, and he counted his steps back to the cottage door, and opened it, and went inside. The door required effort to pull shut against the wind pressing at its outside face, and he pulled it close with both hands and the latch clicked home, and the sound of the gale dropped by half in the instant of the door shutting. He stood inside and let the rain run off his oilskins and took off his boots, and hung up his jacket and went in stockinged feet to the kitchen. He made tea and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark. The window faced east, away from the worst of the weather, and he could see less from this window than from the western window, which he did not stand at in this kind of weather because the glass sometimes rattled in its frame in the strongest gusts, and he did not entirely trust it. He drank his tea and listened to the cottage manage the wind, the building flexing and responding in the way of a solid thing long used to this treatment, and then he went back to bed. He slept until 6 and rose and dressed and went to the lighthouse again and checked the light and the fog signal and the weather instruments and made his log entry and went back to the cottage and made breakfast. Outside the gale continued. The barometer had stopped falling and was sitting at 994, which was low, and the wind was at 55 knots in the gusts on the anemometer reading, which he noted in his log. The sea to the west was not visible from the cottage in this weather, because the spray from the waves breaking on the cliff face was thrown high enough by the wind that it formed a permanent mist along the cliff edge, the spray mist blending with the driven rain into a continuous wet grey beyond which nothing was visible. He ate his breakfast at the kitchen table and stood afterward at the eastern window and looked out at the headland in the grey rain. The eastern aspect of the headland was slightly more sheltered than the western, the worst of the weather coming from the west, and from this window he could see 50 meters or so before the rain absorbed the view, the grass very green and wet, the track visible and then not visible, the world foreshortened to its immediate neighborhood. He had learned to find this foreshortened world sufficient on gale days, had learned not to strain against its limits, but to attend to what was present in it, which was enough. He ate his breakfast at the kitchen table and listened to the weather and made his plans for the day, which were the same plans he made on all gale days. Maintain the light, maintain the log, maintain the equipment, read, cook, sleep when possible. This was the shape of a gale day, and it had been the shape of his gale day since the first winter, the shape having established itself in that first period of sustained bad weather, and having remained consistent since, its consistency a kind of comfort, the predictable structure making the unpredictable weather more manageable. He had found early in his time at Cape Farewell that the imposition of structure on the gale days was more useful than attempting to respond to each day differently, that the routine created a container for the time that the gale's own featurelessness would otherwise dissolve. The gale day had a quality that was different from a calm day, a quality of interiority. The gale pressing the day inward, the options of the calm day, the walk along the headland track, the hour sitting on the flat rock above the southern cliff, the occasional radio conversation with the supply boat when it was in range, all of these unavailable on a gale day, the outdoors not a place for anything except the necessary checks. On a gale day, the cottage became the full extent of the habitable world, and within this reduced world the life organized itself according to the available activities, and the available activities were limited enough that each one occupied more of the day than it would have occupied in a larger world, the reading taking the morning and the cooking taking the late afternoon and the journal taking the evening, the checks of the light dividing these activities at regular intervals. He had brought enough books for 3 years. This had been the advice of the previous keeper, who had been at Cape Farewell for 11 years, and whose advice Owen had taken seriously on everything. The previous keeper had said, "Bring more books than you think you need, because on the gale days the books are what you have, and if you run out of books in a 3-week gale you will understand what cabin fever actually means." The previous keeper had said this without elaborating, and Owen had not asked for elaboration, having trusted the seriousness of the advice from the seriousness of the keeper's tone. Owen had brought 63 books, and he had rationed them over the 3 years and had read each one carefully and slowly, and he still had 27 of them unread, which he considered insurance. He had also received books in the supply deliveries when Almaz, his sister in Hobart, included them, as she did every few months, choosing them herself rather than asking him what he wanted, because she knew what he liked well enough and preferred to surprise him. These additions from his sister had added perhaps 15 books to the 63 of his original supply, and they were good books, better chosen in some ways than his own selections, because his sister had no preconceptions about what he needed at a lighthouse in the Southern Ocean, and simply chose books she thought were good, which was an approach he had come to value. The books he had read at Cape Farewell were different books from the same books read elsewhere. He had found this in his first months at the lighthouse and had found it consistently since, that the reading he did here had a different quality from the reading he had done in the fishing years or the research years, the reading at the lighthouse being slower and more complete, the books going into him more fully. He thought this was partly the silence, or the gale's version of silence, the absence of the usual social and professional ambient noise of a working life, and partly the reduced range of activities, the book not competing with anything else for his attention in the way that a book competed with other things when other things were available. The result was that he remembered the books he had read at Cape Farewell very clearly, more clearly than books he had read elsewhere, and he thought about them at odd moments in the way that only books that had been read slowly and completely came to mind at odd moments. On the first Monday of the gale he read for 4 hours in the morning. The book was a history of the Antarctic expeditions of the early 20th century, a subject he had read extensively on and returned to regularly, finding in the accounts of those expeditions something that resonated with his own experience on the southern edge of the world, the cold and the isolation and the extreme weather being elements of both experiences, though of course nothing in his comfortable stone cottage with its gas stove and its satellite connection approached the conditions those expeditions had endured. What resonated more precisely was the quality of the attention those men had brought to the weather and the landscape, the detailed daily record of conditions that the expedition diaries contained, the care with which they had noted the character of the light and the state of the ice and the behavior of the sea, a care that he recognized from his own practice of close observation. He read, and the wind was very loud, and the cottage shook periodically in the strongest gusts, and the pages of the book turned steadily. He walked to the lighthouse for the midday check, and then cooked a soup. He had been saving the last of the fresh vegetables from the supply that had come 3 weeks before. keeping them for a day when cooking was what there was to do, and the time for it was available, and this was that day. He made the soup slowly, cutting the vegetables at the kitchen table and adding them to the pot in the order that they required, the root vegetables in first because they took longest, and then the softer things, and he stirred the soup and listened to the wind and watched the barometer, which had risen 1 point since morning. The soup was good, the vegetables soft and the broth full of the flavor that comes from long, slow cooking, and he ate it at the kitchen table with bread he had baked the previous day, and drank water, and the wind outside was at 50 knots, and the spray from the cliff base breaking was reaching the upper lip of the cliff, and occasionally being driven over it and past the equipment shed in a fine mist that he could see from the kitchen window when the gusts came. The mist horizontal and then gone as each gust passed. He found the conjunction of the warm soup and the extreme weather outside the window satisfying in the particular way of being warm and fed in bad weather, a satisfaction that was related to but not the same as the warmth and food themselves, the weather giving the warmth and food an additional quality. In the afternoon he wrote in his journal. He had kept a journal at Cape Farewell from the first week, separate from the official log, which was a factual record of the light and the weather and any incidents, the journal a private record of the experience of keeping the light, and he wrote in it most days, though on the gale days he wrote more than on the calm days giving him things to do with himself other than write. He wrote about the gale, the first day of what he felt would be a long one, because the barometer was still low despite its slight rise, and the weather system to the west of the island was, according to the forecast, very large and very slow moving, the kind of system that settled over the Southern Ocean and stayed for a week or two, feeding weather onto the coast of Tasmania in a continuous supply of fronts and troughs. He had been through 3-week gales before, 2 of them, in his first and second winters at Cape Farewell. He knew what they were like. He knew the quality of the 20th day of a gale differently from the way he knew the 5th day, and he knew the first day of calm after a 3-week gale as one of the most specific and remarkable experiences of his time at the Lighthouse. He thought about this on the first day of this new gale, the days ahead of him known in general outline, the particular details of them unknown. The first week of the gale. He logged the weather every 2 hours through the day, and every 2 hours through the night, the entries brief and factual. Time, wind speed and direction, barometric pressure, sea state, visibility, any incidents. He had been logging the weather since his first day at Cape Farewell, and the log was now several volumes, the handwriting in the early volumes different from the handwriting in the later ones. The early entries more deliberate and more detailed than the later ones more economical. The information compressed by familiarity into the shortest form that retained its accuracy. He could read a weather entry from his first year and from his third year, and the information was the same, but the prose was different, the 3 years of twice daily writing having refined the entries to their essential components. The official log was a factual record, but he kept his own informal weather notes in the journal as well, the notes that went beyond the factual into the descriptive, the observations of the quality of the weather rather than its measurements. These informal notes were for himself, a supplement to the official record that captured what the official record did not have space for: the sound of the wind at this speed compared to the sound of the wind at that speed, the difference between the sea at the beginning of a gale and the sea in the third day of one, the quality of the light when it was visible, which in 3 weeks of gale it often was not. The incidents were rare. The light ran without failure. The fog signal sounded when the visibility dropped below the threshold and was silent when it rose above it. He checked the equipment at each visit to the lighthouse, checking the motor that drove the lens and the lamp and the backup lamp, and the emergency generator and the fog signal mechanism and the weather instruments and the mooring of the fog signal duct, which was prone to vibrating loose in sustained high winds. He maintained the log. He maintained the light. This was the work. In the margins of the work there was the living. The cooking, which he took seriously, had taken seriously from the beginning, because cooking was one of the few activities on a gale day that used the hands and the mind together and produced something tangible at the end of it, which was important when the available activities were reduced by the weather to the internal. He cooked proper meals twice a day, breakfast and dinner, and prepared lunch from whatever was easiest, and he kept a list of the meals he had cooked at Cape Farewell in the back of his journal, not systematically, but because he had started doing it in the first month and had not stopped. The list was long now. The books, He read in the morning usually, 3 or 4 hours before the midday check, and sometimes in the evening after dinner if the day had been long and the reading not yet satisfied. He read carefully, not skimming, taking the time that the book required, and in 3 years he had found that this attentive reading in the silence of the headland on a gale day was different from any reading he had done before the Lighthouse, the books entering him more completely in this context, the quiet of the Lighthouse enforcing the kind of attention that busy lives in busy places rarely permitted. On the third day of the gale, the wind reached its highest speed of the period, 68 knots in the strongest gust, a speed that was above the threshold at which Owen took extra precautions with anything unsecured outdoors. 68 knots was hurricane force on the Beaufort scale, or close to it, the scale designating force 12 at 64 knots and above, and the Beaufort scale's description of force 12 conditions was sea completely white with driving spray, visibility seriously affected, and he had confirmed this description from his own observation, the sea below the cliff on the third day being white from the surface down, the colour of the water gone beneath the spray, and the visibility from the cottage window being less than 50 metres for most of the morning. He had a particular interest in the Beaufort scale, had read its history in the first winter, when he was reading everything he could find about the meteorology of the Southern Ocean. The scale had been devised by Admiral Francis Beaufort in the early 19th century as a standardized means of describing wind conditions that would allow comparisons between observations made by different people in different places, the problem that the scale solved being that a term like moderate wind or heavy gale meant different things to different observers and therefore could not be used for comparison. Beaufort's solution was to define each level of the scale by its observable effects on a specific reference, originally a fully rigged man-of-war and later a range of sea conditions and land effects, and the definitions had been refined over the decades since their introduction into the international standard that was still used. Owen had found the history of this practical innovation characteristic of the culture of the sea in the 19th century, the practical problem of communication between vessels and between reports being solved by a systematic and empirical method that had lasted 2 centuries. He had learned in his first gale winter what the wind at this speed could do to things that were not properly secured, had found on the morning after his first 60-knot gale that a piece of equipment shed roofing had lifted and deposited itself on the track 20 meters from where it belonged, and had spent time in the calmer periods since installing additional fastenings on everything that had the potential to move. He spent an hour on the second morning checking the perimeter of the buildings and the equipment shed and the boat shed that held the small emergency tender and the fuel for the generator, making sure everything was secured against what the wind might do at this speed. He found one thing that needed attention, a section of roof sheeting on the equipment shed that had worked a little loose at one edge, the self-tapping screws that held it having stripped slightly in the material over the winters, and he secured it with the additional screws he kept for this purpose in the equipment shed itself, driving them in while the wind tried to take the drill from his hands and the rain drove at his back, the operation taking longer than it would have taken in calm conditions but achievable, the screws going in and the sheeting secured and the job done. He went back inside and changed his jacket, which was wet through despite the oilskin, the rain having found its way in around the collar and through the vent in the back, and he put the wet jacket on the rack above the heater and wore his spare jacket for the rest of the day. The spare jacket was not quite as weatherproof as the main jacket, but was better than nothing, and he made a note in his maintenance list to have the main jacket reproofed at the next supply visit. The days of the first week settled into their pattern, and the pattern became the expected shape of the day, the same rhythm each day, the checks and the log and the cooking and the reading and the journal, and the nights the same rhythm, the 2 hourly checks through the dark and the sleeping between them. He slept well in the gales, had found this surprising in his first gale winter, and had adjusted his expectations since, the sound of the wind in the sea having become the sound of the lighthouse at full weather, as familiar as silence, and the periodic checks through the night having become a natural interruption to sleep rather than a disturbance of it, the body waking at the alarm and the mind going to the task and the body returning to sleep afterward with the ease of the practice. He thought sometimes about the strangeness of the night checks, the going out in the dark in the full gale to confirm that the light was working, walking the 50 meters to the lighthouse in the dark, and the driven rain with his head down and his body leaning into the wind, climbing the 72 stairs in the dark, checking the rotating mechanism and the lamp, descending, walking back to the cottage. The strangeness was not in the work but in the hour, the 2 or 4 in the morning hour when the world was at its most private and the weather was at its least mitigated, the night gale having none of the daylight's compensation of visibility. At those hours on the darkest nights there was nothing to see beyond the beam of his torch, just the beam and the rain within the beam and the darkness beyond it, and the sound of the gale, and the walk to the lighthouse, and the stairs, and the light. On the 5th day of the gale he had a task he had been planning for the right moment, the cleaning and maintenance of the emergency generator. The generator was in the equipment shed, a diesel unit that provided backup power if the main power supply to the lighthouse failed, and its maintenance was on a quarterly schedule that he kept carefully. He had been planning to do this maintenance on a quiet day and had been delayed by the weather, the gale making it impractical to work in the equipment shed for long periods because the shed was not fully weatherproof and the rain came in through the ventilation gaps in the roof when the wind was from the west. On the 5th day he assessed the conditions and decided the generator maintenance could be done. The rain was lighter than it had been and the ventilation gaps were not directly in the wind's path at this angle. He spent 3 hours in the equipment shed with the maintenance manual and the tools, working through the service procedure, changing the oil and the oil filter and the fuel filter, and checking the belts and the coolant level and the battery condition, and running the generator for 20 minutes on low to confirm its operation. The generator ran well. He was glad to have the maintenance done, the quarterly schedule satisfied, and he noted the completed service in the maintenance log, with the date and the readings and his signature. On the 6th day he received his weekly satellite call from the authority. The calls were brief, a few minutes of confirming the light was operational and any maintenance items required, and he reported the wind-loosened roof sheeting as addressed and confirmed the equipment was in order, and the authority confirmed the supply boat would come in 3 weeks as scheduled unless the weather prevented the landing, which it might, if the gale was still running in 3 weeks, the landing at Cape Farewell being possible only in moderate conditions, the small bay on the southern side of the headland being accessible only from the east and giving no shelter from the west or southwest. He thought about the supply boat after the call was over, the prospect of it, which was always a prospect he was aware of in a gale, the supply boat being the measure of connection to the world beyond the headland. It was not that he was lonely, or not exactly, or not in the way that the word usually meant. It was more that the presence of another person for the hours of the supply delivery, the conversations that happened in the practical context of unloading and checking the supplies, the news that the crew carried from the port at Strahan, the small exchanges of information and observation, these things were a specific kind of thing, a quality of exchange that the satellite call did not replicate, and he was aware of their value in the way you became aware of the value of things in their absence. On the 7th day the wind changed direction briefly, moving from due west to northwest for about 6 hours, and this change in direction altered the sound of the wind in the lighthouse structure, the different angle producing a different pitch in the guy wires of the anemometer, and in the spaces between the stone courses of the tower where the wind found entry. He had noticed in his years at Cape Farewell that the lighthouse had a repertoire of sounds that corresponded to different wind directions, the due west wind producing one set of harmonics and the southwest a different set, and that after a while these sounds became as identifying as the barometric reading, the ear telling him what the instruments confirmed. He noted the northwest shift in his log and watched to see if it was the beginning of the gale's end, a northwest shift sometimes being the precursor to the high pressure moving in, but by the middle of the afternoon the wind had veered back to west and the barometer had not moved. The 2nd week of the gale. The barometer had risen and fallen twice through the first week without the weather improving, the system being large enough that the troughs within it brought their own reinforcements of wind and rain each time the pressure rose slightly, and by the beginning of the 2nd week he had stopped watching the barometer for signs of the gale's end and had accepted the gale as the present state of things. This was an adjustment he had learned to make in his first gale winter, the shift from waiting for the gale to end to simply living in the gale, which was the more sustainable mental position, the waiting creating a kind of friction with the present that the acceptance removed. The acceptance did not mean indifference. He remained interested in the weather, noted the patterns of each day, the way the wind varied through the day, and the way the sea responded to changes in wind direction, and he found in this sustained attention to the gale over 2 weeks a familiarity with its particular character that he had not expected. The gale had a daily rhythm. He had noticed this in previous sustained gales, and he noticed it again in this one. The wind was consistently stronger in the middle of the day than in the early morning, and stronger again in the early evening than in the afternoon. And the late night was the quietest part of the 24 hours. the wind dropping slightly to its lowest point at around 3 or 4 in the morning before building again through the early morning hours. This was not a rule but a tendency, and he had been unable to find an explanation for it in the meteorological literature he had consulted, though he suspected it had to do with the heating and cooling of the landmass of Tasmania, affecting the pressure gradient between land and sea at different times of day. He noted the rhythm each day in his informal notes, and found it one of the more interesting features of the sustained gale, the sense that even extreme weather had its own daily pattern. This gale was different from the 2-3 week gales he had been through before, not different in kind but different in quality, the wind having a slightly more southerly component in the gusts than the previous gales, and the sea state being different in the way that the same basic conditions produce different sea states depending on how they arrived and from what direction the swell had been building. He noted these differences in his journal with the interest of someone who had learnt to find the particular within the general, the specific character of this gale within the category of westerly gale. He also noticed the quality of the sound. The gale was louder in the second week than in the first, which he attributed to the swell having had more time to build and the waves therefore breaking higher on the cliff face and producing more total sound energy, the sound of a 5-meter wave breaking on rock being significantly more than the sound of a 3-meter wave. The deep component of the overall sound was most affected, the lowest frequencies of the breaking sea having increased as the wave size increased. And this deep component was the component he felt in his body most directly, the vibration of it travelling through the rock of the headland and into the floor of the cottage, and up through the soles of his feet when he was standing, and into his torso when he was sitting in the armchair. He had become accustomed to this vibration in his first winter, but he still noticed it, still registered the low periodic shudder of the biggest sets breaking below the cliff, as a distinct event, a physical punctuation, in the long sentence of the gale. He spent more time than usual in the second week at the telescope. The lighthouse had an old brass telescope, mounted on a stand at the western window of the upper level of the cottage, a telescope that had been there before his time and that he had cleaned and aligned in his first week, and had used throughout his 3 years for the watching of the sea and the weather and the occasional ship. In the gale the telescope showed him things that were invisible to the naked eye, the detail of the breaking sea on the rocks below the cliff, and the character of the swell approaching from the west, and the occasional seabird using the wind in the way that the albatross used wind, the long-winged birds that appeared in the gales, and that he found endlessly interesting in their mastery of the conditions that he could barely stand in. He spent more time than usual in the second week at the telescope, because there was more to see at the telescope in the gale than in calm conditions, which was counterintuitive but was true. In calm conditions the sea was relatively empty of visible life beyond the occasional seabird, but in the gale the wildlife of the Southern Ocean was more active and more visible, the seabirds using the wind in ways that made them present in large numbers over the headland and the nearby sea, and the large swells generating the breaking conditions on the offshore rocks that brought the seals out to fish in the turbulence. He had identified all the seabird species that used the headland over his 3 years, using the field guide and his own observations, and his list was now comprehensive, the common species known well and the occasional visitor noted with particular interest. The seabirds of the Southern Ocean were a community he had come to know in the way of a person who had spent many hours watching specific individuals over a period of years, the familiarity building through repeated observation until the species were as known as the faces of people he encountered regularly. The black-browed albatross were the most common of the albatross species that came close to the headland, smaller than the wandering but still very large, the black eyebrow mark giving them a particular expression that he found both striking and slightly austere, the expression of a bird that had seen a great deal of open ocean. The shy albatross was another species he had come to know well, the largest of the mollymawks, with a distinctive white cap that separated it from the black-browed in the telescope. And the giant petrels, which were not albatross, but which moved at a similar scale, the two species of giant petrel distinguishable from each other at close range by the color of the bill tip, the southern having a reddish tip and the northern a greenish tip, the distinction requiring the telescope at any range and careful attention, even with the telescope. He had begun recording his seabird observations systematically in his second year, the records being a contribution to the National Seabird Database that was maintained by the university's research group, the group that had organized the researcher's visit in his first year. The records were of species, numbers, and behavior, and he submitted them at the end of each season, and the feedback he received from the group indicated that the Cape Farewell data was among the more consistent datasets in the network, the consistent observation period, and the consistent observer producing a data quality that was difficult to replicate at sites with irregular observation. He took pride in this, in the quality of the record being the contribution that the life at Cape Farewell made to the understanding of the Southern Ocean's biology, the contribution that justified the life in terms that went beyond the personal. The gales reliably brought certain species that were not present in calm conditions, the offshore pelagic birds that spent their lives at sea in all weather and came within sight of land only when the weather systems carried them close, the petrels of several species, the larger shearwaters, and the albatross. The albatross came in the second week of the gale. He saw the first one from the telescope on the 9th day, a wandering albatross, the largest of the species, with a wingspan that the field guide gave as over 3 meters, and that he had confirmed over 3 years of watching them at Cape Farewell as clearly and impressively large, the birds making the other seabirds visible at the same time look ordinary by comparison. This bird came from the west, which was to say it came from the direction of the full gale, and it moved across his field of view from west to east at a speed that the gale made possible, the bird using the wind rather than fighting it, banking and soaring in the way of the albatross, a series of long, curved arcs in which the bird descended toward the wave surface and then rose again on the pressure of the air over the wave crest, the whole motion effortless and continuous, covering the distance from one side of his telescope view to the other in perhaps 30 seconds. He watched the albatross until it was past the headland and out of the telescope's range to the east, and then he turned the telescope back to the west and waited, and after 20 minutes another albatross appeared, moving the same way but slightly south of the first one's track, and then 2 more in the following hour, and by the afternoon of the 9th day he had seen 7 albatross, which was the most he had seen in a single day at Cape Farewell. The albatross appeared on subsequent days of the gale as well, fewer each day, the main body of them having passed in that first flush, but 1 or 2 appearing each morning in the telescope, and he logged them in the journal alongside the weather observations, the birds being part of the record of the gale as much as the barometric pressure was. He had been told by a researcher from the university, who had visited Cape Farewell in his first year, come to count and observe the seabirds of the headland for a week, that the lighthouse at Cape Farewell was a reference point for some of the albatross that moved through the Southern Ocean, that individual birds had been tracked to this headland repeatedly over years, and that the data from the lighthouse's bird observation records was useful to the research. Owen had kept careful records of the birds since this conversation. The 10th and 11th days were notable for a change in the rain. The rain through the first week had been a driving rain, horizontal in the wind, and it had been heavy at times and light at others, but always present and always moving. On the 10th day the rain became a different kind of rain, lighter in quantity but finer in particle size, the drops so small that they did not run down surfaces in the normal way, but coated them, beading on the oilskin and sitting on the lighthouse glass and on every other surface in a fine film of moisture that did not drain but accumulated slowly. This was the sea fog beginning to merge with the rain, the fog arriving from the west while the rain was still falling, the 2 types of water in the air mixing into something between fog and rain, and the visibility, which had been poor in the rain, became worse as the fog mixed in, dropping from 200 meters to 50 meters over the course of the 10th day. The fog signal sound carried a long way. He had asked the authority about the fog signal's rated range when he was first familiarized with the equipment, and they had told him that the signal was rated at a range of 5 nautical miles in standard conditions, the range being the distance at which the signal should be audible to a vessel at sea level, and that the effective range in the fog conditions that the signal was designed for was typically less than the rated range because the fog attenuated sound, the water droplets in the fog absorbing and scattering the sound waves. But 5 nautical miles was still a very long way for a sound to carry, 9 kilometers, and he had thought about this when he first heard the signal from outside the lighthouse, the deep horn note going out into the fog in all directions, carrying its information to a vessel he could not see and could not hear, the signal being the dialogue between the lighthouse and the invisible sea. He had found a record in the lighthouse archive, in the log of a keeper from the 1920s, of a vessel that had reported to the Hobart Port Authority that it had been guided past the Cape in zero visibility fog by the sound of the fog signal, the captain having taken bearings on the signal by ear and navigated around the headland without being able to see it at any point. The log entry had been made after the ship's master had written to the Lighthouse Authority to commend the fog signal's operation, and the keeper had recorded the commendation in his log with evident satisfaction, the acknowledgement from the sea of the lighthouse's purpose being the lighthouse's purpose fulfilled. Owen had read this entry in his first week and had thought about it many times since, the image of the ship in the zero-visibility fog finding the headland by the sound of the horn being exactly the image of what the lighthouse was for, the simplest and most complete expression of its purpose. On the 12th day the fog came in fully, a dense sea fog that reduced visibility to less than 50 meters and triggered the fog signal, and the fog signal ran for the whole of the 12th and the 13th days, sounding its deep horn at the specified interval every 30 seconds, the sound of it reaching out through the fog in all directions, carrying over the sea to any vessel that might be approaching the headland in the zero visibility. He went to check the fog signal at each of his checks through these days, the walk to the lighthouse in the fog a different experience from the walk in the driving rain, the fog having a quality of enclosure that was absolute, the lighthouse visible only as a pale shape until he was almost at the door, and the sound of the fog signal at close range very large, the horn being mounted near the top of the tower and directing its sound seaward, but with a residual sound at ground level that was physically impressive, a sound you felt in the chest. He had stood near the fog signal horn once, in his first year, curious about the experience, and had found that at 10 meters the sound was almost painfully loud, and that it produced a vibration in the air around the horn that you could feel on the skin of your face. He had moved to a respectful distance and observed it from there. In the second week he also cleaned the lighthouse lens. This was a regular maintenance task, done every 2 weeks regardless of weather, the fine optical surface of the rotating lens requiring regular cleaning to maintain its efficiency, and he did it carefully with the materials specified in the maintenance guide, the soft cloth and the cleaning solution, and the careful circular motion, working from the center outward on each face of the lens. The lens was very beautiful, a Fresnel lens of the fourth order, the concentric prisms of optical glass arranged in the geometry that concentrated the lamp's light into the rotating beam, and cleaning it was one of the tasks he found most satisfying, the mechanical simplicity of it, and the beauty of the object combining in a way that made the cleaning feel like a privilege rather than a chore. He spent more time in the second week cooking than he usually spent in the same number of days, partly because the gale made the days long and partly because he had decided at the beginning of the second week that he would cook through the stored provisions methodically, using the gale days for the longer preparations that the calm days made inconvenient by their options. He made a proper stock from the bones he had frozen from the last supply, simmering it for 6 hours on the gas ring, and then straining it and cooling it, and using it as the base for a soup the following day. He made bread every other day, the 2-hour proving, and the 30-minute baking fitting neatly into the rhythm of the day between checks. He made a slow-cooked bean dish with the dried beans he had been storing for the right occasion, the dish taking most of a day to prepare and producing enough for 3 evenings. The cooking was not only practical. It was also what he had found cooking to be in his years at Cape Farewell, a kind of thinking with the hands, a way of being occupied that was different from reading or writing because it was physical, because it required attention to the immediate material, the texture of the dough and the smell of the soup, and because it produced something at the end of it, something real and tangible, which in the abstraction of a gale day was a specific pleasure. The third week of the gale. He was, by the third week, thoroughly inside it. The gale had become the world, the sound of it and the feel of it and the color of it, grey and white and the dark green of the sea, the world reduced to the headland and the cottage and the lighthouse and the immediate surrounding grey, and he moved within this reduced world with the ease of someone who had accepted its dimensions and no longer measured it against the dimensions of anything else. This was the state the previous keeper had described to him, the state of being fully in the gale, and it was, he found, not unpleasant. There was a quality of completeness to it, the world reduced to essentials, the work clear and the routine established and the mind free within the routine to go where it went. He received a letter from his sister Almaz in the second week, included in the satellite data packet that the authority sent weekly. Almaz was 3 years older than him and had stayed in Tasmania, teaching mathematics at a secondary school in Hobart, and she wrote him letters every few weeks in the old-fashioned way of letters, long letters on paper that she scanned and sent as attachments in the data packet, the letters being very different in character from email, more considered and more personal. She had been writing to him throughout his 3 years at Cape Farewell, and the letters had become one of the things he most valued about the life at the lighthouse. The connection they provided being a specific kind of connection that the satellite phone calls did not replicate. The letters' slower and more reflective quality being the quality that suited the lighthouse's own pace, the phone calls being faster and more immediate but less substantial. This letter was about her students, and about the garden she had planted that spring. A new raised vegetable bed she was ambitious about, and about a book she had been reading that she thought he would like, and about what she imagined his gale was like from the forecast she had been following, which was, she wrote, spectacular on the chart. He read the letter at the kitchen table on the 11th day of the gale, while the wind was at 52 knots, and the fog was coming in, and he found the reading of it one of the more pleasant experiences of the second week, the letter bringing Hobart and Alma's and the garden, and the students into the cottage in a way that was warm without being intrusive, the connection being present without requiring anything of him beyond the reading. In the third week, he began to notice the gale in a different way than he had noticed it in the first 2 weeks. In the first week, the gale had been the event, the new thing that required attention and response. In the second week, it had become the sustained condition, the thing that was simply present, and that he had learned to live within. In the third week, it became something else, something he found harder to name, a presence that was so familiar and so total that it had ceased to be noticed as an external thing, and had become in some way internal, the sound of it continuous enough that his mind had incorporated it the way the mind incorporates a constant sound, treating it as a background and attending to it only when it changed. He noticed the gale most when the gusts came, the sudden intensification of the wind every few minutes, because the change from the sustained wind to the gust was a change and therefore noticeable, the steady state of the gale having become invisible in its steadiness. He thought in the third week about the history of the Southern Ocean, and of the ships that had used this coast. The waters he was watching had been some of the most significant in the age of sail. The route from Europe to Australia, via the Cape of Good Hope, passing these latitudes to the south, and the ships making the crossing in the westerlies, that had also made his gale, the same wind that had been keeping him inside for 3 weeks, having driven the square riggers eastward at speeds that made the Southern Ocean route the fastest way from Europe to the Australian colonies. The roaring 40s and the furious 50s had been the highway of the sailing ship era, and the coast of Tasmania had been both the destination and the hazard, the landfall that ships sought at the end of the Southern Ocean crossing, and the coast that could destroy a ship that misjudged a landfall in the dark or the fog. The lighthouse at Cape Farewell had been built precisely to address this hazard, the shipping lane that passed close to the southwest tip of Tasmania, requiring a light that warned of the headland's presence, and the records of ships that had gone aground on this coast before the lighthouse was established were a record of the hazard in its unmitigated form. The dark coast and the heavy swell, and the navigational uncertainty of the pre-lighthouse era. He thought in the third week about the history of the Southern Ocean, and of the ships that had used this coast, and he thought about the men who had sailed those ships in the westerly gales, the sailors and the square riggers, making the Southern Ocean run in conditions that he could observe from his comfortable cottage, and that they had endured in the open, on deck, in the cold and the spray and the dark. He had read the accounts of these passages, the logbooks of the clipper ships and the diaries of the emigrants who had made the crossing on the emigrant ships of the mid-19th century, and the accounts of the storms in these waters had a quality that was all the more vivid for his own knowledge of the Southern Ocean in the gale, the experience of the weather, as he had experienced it being the key to reading the accounts, the familiar sounds and forces being present in the words of the ship captains and the diarists in a way that they had not been present before he had spent 3 winters at Cape Farewell. He thought more in the gales than he thought at other times. Not more actively, not more purposefully, but more freely, the thinking occurring in the spaces of the routine, in a way that did not happen when there were choices to be made about what to do with the time. In the gale, the time arranged itself and the thinking happened in the spaces between the arrangements, and it went where it went, through the past and the present, and sometimes the future, and through things that were not his own life at all but the things he had been reading and thinking about. And it was not anxious thinking, or rarely, because the gale removed the usual provocations of anxiety, the decisions and the communications, and the assessments of the ordinary working world, and what was left was a thinking that was more like observation, the mind looking at things without the pressure to do anything about them. He thought in the third week of the gale about why he was here. Not in the sense of questioning the decision, which had been a good decision and had remained one through 3 years of living it. but in the sense of being curious about the particular quality of the life at Cape Farewell that he had not anticipated before he began it. He had anticipated the isolation, had thought about it, and concluded that it would suit him, and he had been right. He had anticipated the weather, had known from his years on the fishing boats what the Southern Ocean weather was, and it had been what he expected, perhaps more sustained in the gales than he had expected, but not otherwise surprising. He had anticipated the routine, had known that a lighthouse involved maintenance and monitoring and the keeping of records, and he had been comfortable with this from the beginning. What he had not anticipated was the quality of the attention the life required and produced. The sustained attention to one place over a long period had produced a knowledge of the headland and its weather and its wildlife and its sounds and its light at different hours that was different in kind from any knowledge he had had before, a knowledge that was not theoretical but experiential, that lived in his body rather than in his mind. He knew the headland the way he had known certain fishing grounds in the years before the lighthouse, the way experience of a place over time produced an understanding that no description of the place could fully convey. And this knowledge had produced in him a quality of attention he had not previously had, a habit of noticing that extended beyond the headland into everything else, the reading going deeper and the thinking going further, and the daily experience having a richness that the busier years had not produced. He thought about this in the third week of the gale, sitting in the armchair with the Russian novel open in his lap, and the wind at full strength outside and the cottage doing its patient work of keeping him warm and dry. And he found that he was grateful for it, for the life the lighthouse had given him, which was not the life he had planned but was the life he had arrived at, and which he would not have exchanged for the busier alternatives. He thought about his predecessor's advice regarding books. The previous keeper, who had spent 11 years at Cape Farewell before retiring to Hobart, had given him this advice about books with the certainty of someone who had learned it from experience rather than deduction, and Owen had found it to be true in a way that the advice about the weather and the equipment had also been true, the previous keeper being a person whose advice was derived from what had actually happened, rather than from what seemed likely to happen. The 11 years on the headland had given the previous keeper a knowledge of Cape Farewell that was as deep as the knowledge Owen was now in the third year of accumulating, and the difference between 3 years and 11 years was a difference he was aware of, the knowledge he had being substantial but still young, still missing the particular events and conditions that only time would eventually give him, the gales he had not yet seen and the seasons he had not yet observed, and the understanding that would come from the repetition of the same conditions across a longer span of time than he had yet accumulated. He had written to the previous keeper twice since taking the position, the first letter shortly after arriving and the second at the end of his second year, and had received replies to both thoughtful letters from Hobart that gave him context and confirmation in equal measure, the context being the things the previous keeper's longer experience added to his own observations, and the confirmation being the indication that his own reading of the place was accurate, that what he was seeing was what was there to be seen. The second letter had included a passage that he had copied into his journal. "The headland will teach you what it has to teach you in its own time, not yours. You will learn the gales by being in them, not by reading about them, and the knowledge will come from the years, not from the effort. Trust the time." He had found this advice to be correct, the time having been the most productive teacher of anything the lighthouse had to teach, and he thought of it in the third week of the gale with some satisfaction, 3 years into the trusting. On the 16th day he finished the book about the Antarctic expeditions and started a novel he had been saving. A long novel of the Russian kind, dense and patient, and he began it in the armchair on the 16th afternoon with the gale at full strength outside, and found that it suited the gale very well, the novel's long sentences and its interest in interiority, and its patience with the slow accumulation of detail being entirely compatible with the pace of a gale day. On the 17th day he found a problem with the fog signal. He had been doing his evening check and had tested the fog signal activation, as he did every evening regardless of whether the fog had been sufficient to require it, and the signal had not sounded on the first activation attempt. He had tried again and it had sounded on the second attempt, but a fog signal that failed on the first attempt was a fog signal that needed investigation, and he spent 2 hours on the evening of the 17th day with the maintenance manual and the tools, going through the activation circuit and the air compressor system that drove the horn, and he found a relay that was showing signs of corrosion, the contacts not making a clean connection every time, and he cleaned the contacts with the appropriate tools and tested the activation 3 times and found it working correctly on each test. He logged the fault and the repair and noted in his journal that the fog signal maintenance was one of the more important responsibilities of his time at Cape Farewell, and that finding and correcting this kind of problem before it became a failure was precisely the kind of work the authority retained a resident keeper for. On the 18th day of the gale, the wind dropped to 30 knots for about 4 hours in the middle of the day. This was the clearest sign yet that the system was weakening, the sustained drop in wind speed rather than a momentary lull, and he noted it carefully and watched the barometer, which rose from 998 to 1002 in those 4 hours. He did not allow himself to feel that the gale was ending, having been through this before, the false dawn of the reduced wind followed by another night of full gale, but he noted the change and felt it as a change without interpreting it. The wind came back that evening, up to 50 knots by 9, and the barometer fell again to 995, and he went to bed in the full gale and slept. On the 19th day, he made his 2 o'clock check in the rain and the wind, and noted a slight southward shift in the wind direction on the anemometer, which was often the precursor to the gale ending, the wind veering south as the depression moved east. He did not note this in the official log, but he noted it in his journal. On the 20th day the wind was at 35 knots in the morning and 25 knots by evening, and the barometer was at 1008 and rising, and the sea was still very large, but the swell was different, the sharp steep seas of the full gale beginning to give way to the longer and more regular swell of a sea in the process of settling, the waves beginning to organize themselves after the disorder of the gale. He stood at the western window of the cottage in the evening and watched the sea and knew that the gale was going. On the 19th day he made a meal he had been planning for the last few days of the gale, a slow-roasted lamb that took 4 hours in the small oven, and it cooked through the afternoon and the smell of it filled the cottage, and he ate it at the kitchen table in the early evening with a glass of the wine he had been keeping. He wrote in his journal that the meal had been excellent and the timing right, the 19th day of the gale being an appropriate occasion. On the 21st day he woke to silence. Or rather he woke to the sound of the sea, which was still large, the swell built up over 3 weeks of gale needing days to settle fully, the waves still breaking on the cliff rocks with considerable force. But the wind was gone, or nearly gone, a light northerly at 8 knots on the anemometer, and the sound of this after 3 weeks of the westerly was the sound of silence by comparison, the absence of the driven rain against the windows and the wind through the lighthouse structure, and the continuous roar of the gale-driven sea conspiring to produce what felt like quiet, even though the sea was still audible. He lay in bed and listened to the near silence for several minutes. He had not heard silence in 3 weeks, or what passed for silence on this headland, which was never truly silent, the sea always present, and the wind always at some level above zero, but which had in the calm the quality of silence by comparison with the gale. It was not quite 6 in the morning, and the sky outside the window was the deep grey of an early winter morning before the sun was up, and he could hear the sea, the waves still breaking with force on the rocks below, but the sound had changed in quality, was a sound rather than a roar, was intermittent again rather than continuous, and between the waves there was quiet, actual quiet, the wind not filling the gap as it had for 3 weeks. In the quiet he could hear things that the gale had covered, a bird, somewhere to the south of the cottage, singing in the dark before the light. He lay very still to hear it better. The bird was not a species he could identify from this call alone, a single repeated phrase of 3 notes, not melodic in the way of some species, but clear and insistent, and it sang steadily and patiently in the pre-dawn dark without seeming to require a response. He thought it might be a flame robin, or a scrubwren from the sheltered gully below the southern face of the headland, the gully being the one area of the headland that held enough vegetation to shelter small birds in bad weather, and in the gale weeks he had sometimes heard the calls of the scrubwrens from that gully even through the noise of the weather, the birds having learned over generations to use that sheltered slot. Whatever the species, the song was the first song after the gale, the first vocal evidence of the wildlife that the headland held in its more sheltered places, and he lay and listened to it, and thought of all the small lives that had been going on through the 3 weeks of the gale in the places, sheltered enough to permit them, in the gully and under the overhangs of the rocks, and in the tangles of the prostrate vegetation that was low enough to be below the wind's worst force. The headland was not empty of life in the gale, was never empty, but the life was quiet in the gale, withdrawn, managed down to its essentials, as his own life had been managed down to its essentials through the 3 weeks, and the birds singing was the reopening of the life of the headland, as his walking would be the reopening of his own. He listened to it and was very glad of it, was disproportionately glad of it, the gladness being in proportion not to the bird but to the 3 weeks of gale that had preceded it, the bird being the first thing he had heard that was not the gale in 3 weeks. He also heard the small sound of water dripping from the cottage gutters, the last of the rainfall draining away, and this too he was glad of, the small domestic sound of the cottage managing the aftermath of the rain, the gutters doing their work, the water finding its way off the roof and down the pipes and away. He got up slowly, which was not his usual way, and dressed slowly, and went to the kitchen and made tea, and stood at the kitchen window with the teacup and looked out at the grey morning. The eastern sky was showing the first suggestion of the light to come, the grey there slightly less deep than the grey elsewhere, and the outline of the headland track was visible against it, the familiar path that he had not walked in 3 weeks. He could see the track for its full visible length from this window, which was longer than he could see in the gale, and the visibility was perhaps 200 meters in the direction of the track, which meant the weather was already different in kind from the gale, where 200 meters would have been a good day. He thought about the 3 weeks as he drank his tea, or tried to think about them sequentially, which was difficult because the gale presented itself in memory as a single sustained thing rather than as 21 separate days. The days that stood out most clearly were the small moments within the general, the 7 albatross on the 9th day, the fog signal repair on the 17th, the lamb on the 19th. The gale itself was the background, the 3 weeks of weather that framed these moments, and the moments were clear while the gale was a general impression, grey and loud and sustained. He drank his tea. He went to the lighthouse and checked the light, which he would turn off at dawn as usual, and checked the equipment, and came out of the lighthouse door and stood on the outside. He stood on the outside of the lighthouse door and felt the air. The air was still in the way that after a long gale the air is always still, unnervingly still, the body having calibrated itself to the constant force of the wind, and now finding the absence of it startling, and he stood in the still air and breathed it. The air smelled different without the gale. The gale carried the smell of the sea constantly, the salt and the cold of the Southern Ocean mixed into every breath, and this smell was present in the calm air too, but differently, less insistent, present as a background rather than as the whole. He went to the lighthouse first, the 6 o'clock check, and he climbed the stairs in the quiet of the windless morning, the stairs that in the gale had always transmitted the vibration of the weather, the iron of them conducting the sound and the movement of the gale into the body that touched them, but now were simply stairs, still, and he climbed them and checked the light and descended and came out of the lighthouse door into the still morning. He stood on the outside of the lighthouse door for a long time. He did not go immediately to the cliff edge, though the cliff edge was what he wanted, but stood first at the lighthouse door and let the morning settle around him. The stillness was very complete. The wind at 8 knots from the north was present, but was nothing, was a breeze, was a different order of thing from the wind of the previous 3 weeks, and in the stillness of it he could hear things that the gale had covered, the call of a bird from somewhere on the eastern side of the headland, a simple repeated phrase, the distant sound of the sea, still large but intermittent now, audible between the waves rather than as a continuous presence, and underneath both of these a silence, an actual silence, the kind that the gale had banished for 3 weeks. He walked to the cliff edge. He had not been to the western cliff edge in 3 weeks, the walk there being both impossible and pointless in the gale, impossible because the wind at the cliff edge would have been dangerous and pointless because nothing was visible in the driven spray and rain. Now he walked to the edge slowly, the track still wet and slippery from the weeks of rain, and he stood at the edge and looked out at the sea. He had seen the calm after the gale twice before in his 3 years at Cape Farewell, and each time it had had this quality of revelation, the sudden availability of the world after its 3-week withdrawal, the colours and the sounds and the scale of things restored to him as though they were new, though they were not new, with the same headland and the same sea he had been living beside through the gale. He had tried to explain this quality to his sister Olmars in a letter written after the second 3-week gale, and she had understood it, or had said she understood it, though he thought the understanding of it required the experience of it and that, without the experience, the explanation was insufficient. The sea in the early morning after the 3-week gale was extraordinary. The swell was still very large, 4 or 5 meters from trough to crest by his estimation. The long blue-grey rollers moving from the west and breaking on the rocks below the cliff in eruptions of white, that went higher than the cliff top in the largest sets, the spray falling back down the cliff face in rivulets. But between the sets, the sea surface had a quality he had not seen in 3 weeks. A moment of relative stillness between the passing rollers, the swell having organization now that the gale wind no longer broke up its surface, the waves moving in their long ordered procession from west to east, each one following the one before at a regular interval. In the gale, the sea had been chaotic, the surface broken in all directions by the wind waves superimposed on the swell. But now the wind was gone and the swell was all that was left, and the swell had the beauty of organized motion, the long regular waves moving through the water with a permanence and a purpose that the chaos of the gale had not allowed. The color of the sea was different too. In the gale it had been a uniform white-green, the white of breaking water mixed with the green of the wave faces below the breaking crests, and the visibility being limited by the spray had removed any depth of color. Now the deep water to the west was visible, the blue-grey of deep southern ocean water, a specific color that was neither blue nor grey but both, the color of very cold, very deep water under a cloudy sky, and the wave crests in the early light were white, and the wave troughs were the deep blue-grey, and the contrast of these colors, blue, grey and white, repeated across the visible sea to the horizon, was beautiful in the specific way that large-scale organized phenomena were beautiful. He stood at the cliff edge for a long time. He was not sure how long because he had not brought his watch, and he did not feel the cold particularly, or he felt it but it was not what he was attending to, and the light came slowly up around him as he stood there, the grey of early morning deepening into the pale gold of a winter's low sun, breaking through the clouds to the east, the sun not visible directly but its light beginning to reach the sea from the east, the wave crests catching it and the troughs remaining in shadow, and the whole sea becoming more vivid as the light increased, the blue-grey going deeper and more saturated and the white of the crests more bright. A ship appeared. He had not seen a ship in 3 weeks. The shipping lanes that passed this part of the Tasmanian coast were not heavily used, but a ship or two a week appeared on the horizon in calm conditions, and in the gale of course none had been visible, and the fog signal had been running on the worst days in case a vessel was approaching. Now a ship appeared on the western horizon, the silhouette of a bulk carrier, low in the water and moving southeast at the pace of laden cargo ships, perhaps 12 or 14 knots, its progress visible against the fixed horizon. He watched it for a while, the familiar shape of a ship being a specific pleasure after 3 weeks of seeing nothing but sea and sky and headland, the ship being the evidence of a world beyond this one, the evidence that other people were out here in the Southern Ocean too, going about their particular version of the work of the sea. He walked back along the cliff edge to the cottage. The track was wet and slippery in places where the rain had accumulated in the depressions, small, shallow pools of water on the packed earth of the path, and he walked carefully, watching his footing, but he also looked up and around as he walked, which he had not been able to do on the gale checks, the looking in those conditions being limited to the immediate ground. The grass on either side of the track was very green, greener than he had noticed it before the gale, the green vivid in the low morning light, the grass well watered and responding to 3 weeks of rain with growth that was visible even in winter, the blades of it long and lush and beaded still with the overnight dew. The track followed the cliff edge for about 100 meters, and then turned inland slightly to the cottage and the lighthouse, and he walked it slowly, looking at the headland as he walked. The headland in the calm after the gale was very quiet and very present, the silence allowing him to hear his own footsteps on the wet grass and the creak of his jacket in the light wind and the small sounds that the gale had covered entirely for 3 weeks. The rocks of the dolerite cliff were dark and wet, the water running in thin streams down the faces of the columns, and the lichens on the rock surfaces were vivid in the morning light, the oranges and greens of them bright against the dark stone in a way they were not visible in the grey weather, the colour in the lichens requiring light to show, and the morning light, even the flat winter morning light, being sufficient after 3 weeks of grey. He stood at the cliff edge for a long time, watching the sea in the early morning, and when the cold on his face and hands told him it was time to go back, he walked slowly back along the cliff track, looking at everything he had not been able to look at in 3 weeks, the lichens on the rocks and the mat of grass on the headland and the shape of the cliff face where it curved away to the north. And when he got back to the cottage, He was aware of having been outside in the morning, which was a different awareness from the awareness of having been outside to do the 2-hourly check in the gale, the morning having been a full experience rather than a task. He made breakfast when he got back, a proper breakfast, taking time with it. Eggs from the supply he had been rationing through the gale, keeping them for a breakfast worth having, scrambled in butter with care, not rushed, the butter in the pan before the eggs, so that the eggs went into heat, rather than to coolness, and toast from the bread he had baked 2 days ago, slightly dry now but toasted well. He ate at the kitchen table and looked out the kitchen window at the eastern side of the headland, which was sheltered from the west and which in the calm was very still. The sea visible to the southeast a pale blue, the first blue he had seen in 3 weeks, and the sky above it clearing as the morning advanced, the clouds that had covered everything for 3 weeks beginning to break apart as the high pressure moved in from the west. He spent the middle hours of the calm day's morning doing maintenance work he had been accumulating through the gale, the work that required the outdoors or that benefited from better conditions than the gale allowed. He checked all the external fastening points of the anemometer and the weather instruments, tightening 2 bolts that had worked slightly loose. He cleaned the lighthouse glass from the outside, a task he did monthly, the salt spray from the gale having deposited a film on the glass that reduced the light's efficiency, and he cleaned it with the squeegee and the cleaning solution, while standing on the small external platform at the top of the tower, the sea visible far below him and the air very clear and very cold. The work took 30 minutes and the glass afterward was clean and clear, the lighthouse ready for the night. In the afternoon the sun came out. It came out at about 2 o'clock, the gap in the clouds widening from a streak to a section, and then to a half sky of blue, and the sun was low in the winter sky, the angle of it giving a quality of light that he associated with the calm days after winter gales, a low golden light that fell at a shallow angle across the headland and struck the wet rocks and the wet grass and the white paint of the lighthouse from the side, and everything cast long shadows to the east, and the shadows were very sharp and clear in the way that shadows in winter afternoon light were sharp and clear. He walked the whole headland in the afternoon. He had not done this in 3 weeks, and he felt it, the body needing the movement after the confinement of the gale, needing the walking and the open air and the distance. He put on his boots and his jacket, and went out at about 1 o'clock, when the sun was as high as it would get on a winter's day at this latitude, and he walked the 3 kilometers of the headland track that circled the whole cape, the track going along the western cliff edge, and then around the northern point, and then back along the eastern side. He walked it slowly as he had walked anything in 3 weeks, not because his legs needed the slowness, but because the walking was for looking as much as for moving, and looking required time. The track along the western cliff edge was very different to walk in the calm than in the gale. In the gale he had walked it only on the necessary checks, staying close to the ground, head down, his body negotiating the wind rather than the landscape. Now he walked upright and looked at the sea below the cliff, and at the headland on both sides and at the sky. The cliff face below him on the western side was extraordinary in the calm after-gale light. The dolerite columns that made up the cliff were very dark and wet, the water still running down their faces in thin streams, and the joints between the columns were highlighted by the different color of the water film, making the structure of the rock face visible in a way that the spray and the driven rain of the gale had concealed. The dolerite of Cape Farewell was part of the vast dolerite intrusion that had formed across Tasmania in the Jurassic period, 200 million years ago, when the supercontinent of Gondwana was beginning to break apart, and the magma that would become the dolerite had forced its way upward into and over the sandstones and mudstones of the existing rock sequence, cooling over millions of years to the fine-grained dark rock that was now the bones of the island and the headland and the cliffs. He had read about the geology of the southern Tasmanian coast in his first year at Cape Farewell, had found the geological story of the region compelling in the way of stories that took place over time scales so large that the human scale became negligible, the Jurassic being not 200 million years ago in any experiential sense but simply unimaginable, a duration that could be stated but not understood. The lichens on the rock were old too, in the timescales of lichens. Lichens grew very slowly, some species adding only 1 millimeter or 2 per year to their diameter, and the large patches of orange and green lichen he could see on the cliff face below were certainly decades old, and might be a century or more. the lichen having established itself in the joint between two columns at some point in the past and growing outward from that point at a rate too slow to observe, the growth being visible only by comparing photographs taken years apart. He had photographed several of the large lichen patches on the headland's rocks in his first months, and had intended to rephotograph them periodically, the documentation of the lichen growth being a small personal project alongside the official seabird recording, and he had rephotographed them twice in 3 years, and found the change too small to measure from photographs alone, which confirmed the slowness of the growth and the patience required to document it. The lichens would outlast him on this headland, would outlast the lighthouse perhaps, would be on this rock face in 100 years as they were on it today, slightly larger, still doing the slow work of breaking down the rock surface, still colouring the face of the cliff with their oranges and greens in the winter light. He could see clearly from the top of the cliff how the columns had formed, the pattern of their formation visible in the geometry of the joints, the regular polygonal cross-sections of the columns at dolerite always formed as it cooled, the same geometry he had seen at the organ pipes on the Tasman Peninsula, and at various other places on the Tasmanian coast where the dolerite cliffs were the cliff faces. He walked it in the low winter sun with the long shadows going ahead of him, and the sea on both sides and the sky above him opening further as the afternoon progressed. At the northern point of the headland he stood and could see in both directions along the coast, the Tasmanian coast running northwest from where he stood and southwest behind him, the dark dolerite cliffs continuing in both directions as far as the afternoon haze allowed him to see, the cliffs dark and wet and the sea at their base white where the swell still broke with considerable force. The sea beyond the immediate white of the breaking was the deep blue of the cold southern ocean in high pressure, a blue that was nothing like the blue of warmer waters, a darker and more serious blue, the blue of water that had come from a very long way south and was very cold and very deep. The swell was still visible moving from the west, the long rollers tracking across this blue toward the shore, and the white of their breaking very bright in the sun. He stood at the northern point for a long time. From here he could see the lighthouse, the white tower visible against the headland to the south, and the cottage beside it, and the small cluster of equipment buildings, the whole of Cape Farewell visible from this one point at the northern extremity of the headland. It looks small from here, the lighthouse and the cottage, smaller than they felt from inside, the scale of the headland and the sea putting them in proportion, and he thought about scale in the way he sometimes thought about it, the way the lighthouse had a different scale depending on where you were looking from, very large from the cottage door and very small from the northern point. His own scale was similarly relative, very present from inside his own life, and very small from the perspective of the southern ocean that lay before him in every direction except east. He stood there for a long time, as he had stood at the western cliff edge in the morning. Standing and looking was one of the things the headland gave that other places did not give in the same way, the standing and looking being given full permission here by the scale of what there was to look at, the scale making it appropriate to stand still for as long as it took, the view not exhausted by any amount of looking. He walked back to the lighthouse in the late afternoon, the shadows very long now and the light on the sea from the west very warm, the last of the sun's warmth in the horizontal light of late winter afternoon. He checked the light and made his log entry, and made his weather observations, the barometer at 1014 and the wind at 10 knots from the north-northwest, and the sea state moderate and decreasing. The sea was still running large on the gale swell, but the swell period was longer now than it had been in the gale, the waves more organized and less steep, the breaking on the cliff rocks still considerable but less explosive, and he watched it for a while from the lighthouse door before going in to make his entries. He noted in the log that the 3-week gale was over. He wrote this factually, as he wrote everything in the log. Gale conditions ended. Wind light and variable. Barometric pressure rising. He noted in his journal something different, which was an attempt to describe what the calm after the gale was as an experience, rather than as a meteorological fact. He wrote that it was what it always was, which was more than he could say before it happened, and less than it was while it was happening, the experience always exceeding the anticipation, and the description always falling short of the experience. He wrote that he had stood at the cliff edge in the morning and seen the sea in the long swell condition after the gale, and that it had been very beautiful. He wrote that the afternoon sun had come out, and the shadows had been long, and the rocks had been bright with their lichens. He wrote that he had walked the full headland and seen a ship on the western horizon, and heard a bird in the early morning dark. He wrote that all of these things were simple things, and that the gale had made them remarkable. He made dinner and ate it and washed up. He ate at the western window this evening, having moved the kitchen chair to the window for the purpose, sitting at the window and eating and looking out at the sea, in the last of the evening light, the sun having set an hour before, but the sky still holding the afterglow of it, the western horizon a pale orange fading to the grey-blue of the upper sky, and the sea in this light a dark pewter, the swell still moving from the west in its long procession, and the wave crests catching the last of the sky's light and showing white. He sat and ate and watched the sea go from the last of the day's light into the dark of the evening, the horizon disappearing and the sky and the sea becoming the same undifferentiated dark, and the lighthouse beam beginning its sweep above and behind him, the light starting its night's work. He sat in the armchair and read for an hour. He did not read the Russian novel, which was what he had been reading through the gale, but took out one of the books of poetry he had on the shelf, a collection he had read before, and that he returned to on particular evenings, and he read from it slowly, some poems several times, and the cottage was very quiet around him, and the evening was very long after the shortened evenings of the gale. He went to bed at 9, later than his usual gale day bedtime, the late hour a small luxury of the calm day. The alarm set for 2 for the check, but the night between now and 2 available for sleep, uninterrupted, no fog signal sounding, no wind rattling the windows, the sea still audible but quiet, the long swell breaking on the rocks below the cliff in a steady and gentle rhythm, the kind of rhythm that was easy to sleep to, the sound of the sea in the aftermath of storm. He lay in the dark and listened to the silence. He had slept well every night of the gale, which was one of the things he had found surprising about the lighthouse life, that the gale nights were good sleeping nights, the body accepting the sounds of the gale as the sounds of the place at its most intense version of itself and sleeping within them. But this was a different sleeping, the calm night sleeping, the body knowing even in sleep that the gale was gone, and he lay in the dark and was aware of the quality of the silence before he was fully awake, the silence being registered before the consciousness that registered it was fully present. The bird was silent now, wherever it had gone after its morning singing. The gale had been a long interruption of a specific kind, an interruption of the ordinary quiet of the headland that he had learned in 3 years to take as a kind of baseline, the ordinary quiet being not truly quiet but quieter than the gale, the wind and the sea at their ordinary levels being the familiar background against which the gale was an intensification. The gale had intensified everything, every sound and every motion and every requirement, and now the gale was gone and the ordinary had returned, the ordinary being what he had always found more interesting than exceptional conditions, precisely because the ordinary was what accumulated over time and built the knowledge of a place that only time could build. The wind was barely audible, just the light northerly moving through the lighthouse structure at a low level, a sound more like breathing than wind. He lay and listened to the breathing of the lighthouse, which he had noticed before in calm conditions, but which he noticed more particularly on this first calm night after the gale, the contrast between the gale's full voice and this quiet sound very clear. The lighthouse breathed quietly in the light, northerly, and he breathed quietly in the dark of the bedroom, and the 2 breathings were the sounds of the night. The sea was there, constant and steady, the swell from the 3 weeks of gale still arriving from the west, and would arrive for days yet, gradually subsiding as the fetch shortened and the weather system that had generated it moved further away, but for now still large enough to break on the rocks with force, and this sound, the sound of the sea in the aftermath of storm, steady and rhythmic and continuous, was the sound of the headland at rest. In the morning the wind came back, a light westerly, 8 knots on the anemometer, and the barometer held steady at 1012, and the sky was partly cloudy with the high cirrus that followed a depression east, and the sea was still large on the swell but decreasing, the 4-meter swell of the calm day's morning declining slowly, as the fetch to the west shortened with the depression's eastward movement. The calm had lasted 1 day. This was not a disappointment. He had known it would be 1 day, had felt from the forecast and the barometric trend that the high pressure was moving through, and that the moderate conditions would return, not another gale immediately, but the ordinary weather of this coast, which was enough. He made his log entry, date, time, wind speed and direction, barometric pressure, sea state, visibility, any incidents. The entry was brief and factual, as all his entries were, and it noted the end of the 3-week gale period and the 1 day of calm and the return of moderate conditions, and he read it back after writing it and thought that it told the truth of what had happened without telling the full truth, which was what log entries were for, the full truth being for the journal. He wrote in the journal that morning for an hour. He wrote about the gale, the 21 days of it, the routine and the books and the cooking and the thinking and the albatross and the fog signal repair. And he wrote about the calm day that had followed, the morning at the cliff edge and the light on the sea and the ship on the western horizon and the walk around the headland in the afternoon sun. And he wrote about what the calm after the gale was and what it was not, the things it gave back that the gale had taken and the things it could not give back that was simply the result of 3 weeks passing in any condition. He made his breakfast and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the beginning of the ordinary weather, the ordinary grey of the southern Tasmanian winter, the familiar middle state between the gale and the perfect calm. He had been in this middle state for the majority of his 3 years at Cape Farewell, and he had found it good, the ordinary grey of it not oppressive but simply the context of the work. He had spent a long time learning to find this ordinary grey sufficient, and had arrived at the finding of it, the comfortable inhabitation of the middle weather, which was what the life at Cape Farewell required, and which was what it had taught him. He drank his tea and watched the morning settle around him. The gale was a memory now, 3 weeks of it reduced to the log entries and the journal pages and the sense memory of the sound and the force of it. And the calm was also a memory, one extraordinary day, and what remained was the headland and the lighthouse and the ordinary grey morning and the sea to the west on its swell and the light ready for the night. He set his cup down and went to the lighthouse for the morning check, and the day began in the way it began, with the 72 stairs and the lamp room and the beam ready for the night, and the log entry and the weather reading, and then back to the cottage and the ordinary morning at Cape Farewell, the headland quiet and the sea large on the swell and the lichens on the dark rocks of the cliff face bright with their oranges and greens in the winter light, and the bird somewhere to the south still singing its 3 notes, and the albatross somewhere out to sea on the westerly, riding the air above the waves in the long curve that covered hundreds of miles in a day, and the supply boat in 3 weeks if the weather permitted, and the next gale in some interval of weeks that the barometer and the forecast would predict, and the light tonight as it had been every night for 160 years, and the log, and the work, and the place, all of it as it was and as it would continue to be, the ordinary particulars of life on the southwestern edge of the world, which was sufficient. The bird was back, the singing bird from the pre-dawn of the calm day, and he could hear it from the kitchen window, the same 3-note phrase, patient and clear, and he listened to it as he drank his tea and looked at the sea and thought that the headland was itself again after the 3 weeks, the gale having been a condition and not the place, and the place being as it was before the gale and after it, the rock and the grass and the lighthouse and the sea, the ordinary particulars of this specific point at the southwestern edge of Tasmania. He set his cup down and went to the lighthouse for the morning check, and he climbed the 72 stairs and checked the light and descended and came out into the morning. And the wind was at 8 knots from the west, and the sky was partly cloudy, and the sea was large on the swell, and the lighthouse was, as it had been for 160 years on this headland, keeping its light and its log and its patient record of the weather, which was what it was for, which was what he was for, and the day was beginning and the work was continuing and the light would be ready for the night.